Hi, my name is Sam and welcome to Carve's Performance Garage. On this video, I'm going to be showing you 8 essential items you need as a home mechanic. When you're someone like me and you're a home mechanic and you're self-taught and you've never really worked in a professional workshop, one thing that is hard to pick up and learn is what kind of tools, supplies, equipment and expendables you need that will really help make your life easier, yourself safer, and the work that you're doing to the cars better. With none of that experience, luckily, because I've been doing this for quite a while now, I have done lots of research, I've seen what other mechanics do and pick up tips and tricks from them. Plus also friends have suggested some of these items to me which they use as a mechanic themselves, so I started using them too. These are all items that I pretty much use every single time I work on a car, and I'm so grateful that I've eventually learned all of this stuff, and so I'm going to share that all with you today. So let's get into it, and I'll show you all of these items and why you should get them and why they are so important and so helpful to me. So the first item on this list is something I got shown really early when I started working on cars by some mechanic mates, and that is Scotchbrite. Scotchbrite is an abrasive pad that is used for cleaning and can be used on so many different tasks in your engine bay to help ensure you get the best quality seal by having a nice, clean, contaminant-free surface to begin with. My common uses for these is when I'm doing any sort of cleaning on gasket surfaces. So for example, if I'm doing a new sump, then basically you've got the sealant on there, you remove the sump and a bit of sealant gets left behind. You can use a blade to scrape as much off, but unfortunately the last little bit is often the hardest to scrape off with a blade. So you can use this stuff to get the last little bit of sealant. Plus then also, if you need to, for example, you're removing manifold, the manifold gasket sometimes gets stuck, so you can use this to help remove the final bits of gasket. Some other quick applications, you can use it for scuffing for paint preparation, you can use it to clean corrosion off bolts, you can use it to clean any sort of like mating surfaces, and pretty much anything that you're going to be applying sealant, grease, or a gasket on. These are the two types that I use. They're both 3M brand because I've used other brands before and they're generally not that good. I try to use 3M for all of my abrasives because a good quality abrasive actually makes a huge difference. I use the grey and the maroon stuff. The grey stuff I mainly use for paint prep or any sort of finer stuff as it's less abrasive, but the maroon stuff is more abrasive, so I pretty much use it for everything else. I buy it in these rolls of 50, and a roll of 50 basically lasts me an entire year, and I would say I'm a heavy user compared to a lot of other home mechanics. So you can always just buy a roll, divide it up across some friends, and you'll all have enough for quite a while. So that's Scotchbrite, and now on to the next item. The next item on my list is also something I was shown by some mechanic friends really early on, and that is paint pens / paint markers. These bad boys are really useful because they can help you save time, effort, plus also help reduce some anxiety when working on cars. I say that because some uses for these is when you're torquing up some bolts, I put a quick mark on there or a dot on there just to show that I have already torqued it to spec. Or on suspension components, I quickly mark where the nut sits after it's been torqued so I can clearly see if that bolt has moved at all so I can make adjustments. And if you go through and you mark every single bolt that you have tightened, it means when you do a quick inspection just before you're about to finish, you can see, yep, that one's done, that one's done, that one's done, or that one's not. So they are really useful, and I use them so often. But now onto the next item. So the next item is something that I've found to use a lot more as time goes on, and that is brake cleaner. I'm not going to go into any debates of why you should use brake cleaner or degreaser in certain applications. I just buy brake cleaner. I also have degreaser, but I mainly use brake cleaner whenever I am working on any sort of components and whatnot, but then I'll use degreaser for really heavy cleaning. Best thing about brake cleaner is that it evaporates, so it means that you don't need to wipe it up, but you use it for cleaning any sort of surfaces to remove contaminants. So different tasks that you would use this stuff for, it has in the name brakes. You use it on rotors. When you open up a new rotor, there's always some residue on the rotor surface that you need to clean off. That's just oil from the manufacturing process, and if you don't clean it off, then it gets in your brake pad and it can destroy the brake pad and severely reduce your braking performance and can actually be quite dangerous. I also use it after using the Scotchbrite because it means that once it's nice and clean, I can use this to get all the fine dust and particles off, and then I can give it a final wipe down. It's really good at cleaning surfaces, and I use it on every surface just before I apply a gasket or a seal on it, plus then also if I'm using a sealant. Because if the surface is clean, you can be more confident that whatever seal you're trying to make will be a lot more effective. So on to the next item. So the next item is something that I've really come to appreciate in the last few years. Pretty cool being able to work on your own car. It's pretty cool having a good looking car. And it's also really cool having a car that can do a really fast lap time around the track. But there's one thing cooler than all of those combined, and that is safety. Nothing is cooler than safety. These are pretty much the items that I use most often, and I would say these are the essential items you really need as well. So safety glasses is great when doing any sort of cutting, grinding, or anything where metal or debris could flick up into your eyes. Plus also working underneath cars, especially really dirty ones, and especially if you're working on your back on the floor. If you're working under the car, I'm sure everyone has done the turn and then spit, blow, or the rub because they've got dirt on their face. So I'm so glad I started wearing these, especially back when I used to work underneath cars, because it has probably saved my eyesight. Hearing protection, of course, because it is good to see, but it's also really good to hear, especially when grinding and cutting and whatnot. And I try to remember to put it on when doing, like, for example, suspension components, because when using the impact gun on suspension components, an example is using the impact on the drive shaft nut, it's really loud. So I try to always remember to put these on when doing that stuff. Some nice reusable, durable gloves for also any sort of cutting, grinding, anything hot as well, sharp edges. And then my main thing, which is rubber gloves. Even though these are not the thickest or the best protection, the amount of like cuts, grazes, nicks I've prevented in my hands just from wearing these is incredible. Plus also when you're working with a lot of chemicals and whatnot, you don't want the chemicals to get onto your skin and they leach in. Plus also when you're working on really dirty, greasy cars, nothing's worse than when you need to go quickly duck inside or like go on your phone, or for example with me, when I'm filming, you can just quickly take the glove off. Even though you're not meant to reuse them, you can always just put them back the other way, reuse them, and because you've been wearing gloves, you've got clean hands to do that task that you need to make sure you don't get greasy or grimy. Worst thing about these gloves is because they are disposable and technically single use, they do cause a lot of waste, but it's a safety measure, and even though I try to be as earth friendly as possible, this is something I'm not going to change out. Just a quick little tip with gloves is definitely try a few brands. Some are more durable than others. And if you do find a brand that is durable in your size, bulk buy them, because nothing's worse when they change the line or the shop stops selling them. And then all of a sudden you've run out of gloves and you then need to get your hands dirty, which doesn't sound like too big of an issue, but once you start using gloves, you'll never go back. So from gloves, let's go on to the next item. When I first started working on cars, whenever I removed a bolt, I always just put it anywhere on the cowl, on the ground, and stuff gets lost, stuff gets mixed, and especially when you're just starting off, it's hard to know what bolt goes where. So, organization trays are the absolute bee's knees when it comes in terms of fixing this problem. Even now, I've been working on Subarus for quite a few years, and I can absolutely do stuff, put the bolts on the cowl or wherever, and I'll know exactly where each bolt goes. But when you're doing engines and whatnot, having every bolt organized in a tray, nice and neatly, all in groups, absolutely saves so much time and so much effort. Even though I've been working on Subarus for a few years now, I still use them whenever I am doing any sort of build because it just saves so much time and effort, and it's an absolute no-brainer. So for example, this is the bolt box for my girlfriend's car, Miss EJ. As you can see right here, this has got exhaust bolts in it, plus then this has got sump bolts in it, and then clips, and it's just so useful to have. So I have so many, so it means that I can always use one, maybe in storage while I'm finishing a build for a while, but I'll always have a few spare. I also like to buy these ones with the removable components, because one thing that is really useful is, for example, with sump bolts, they can get really oily and greasy. What you can do, you can just put a bit of degreaser in here to help soak them before you give them a final clean. And you can also just give these individual bins a quick little clean, so everything will be nice and tidy. And being able to lift them up and take them over to the part that you're working on is also extremely handy. I also have some different sizes and thicknesses, so depending on what I'm working on. So for example, this would be used for like suspension stuff because the bolts are bigger, and then I have ones with more compartments for engine stuff. So these are absolute necessities in my eyes and have helped me save so much time and effort. But on to the next item. So the next items are really useful to have because they have so many different uses, and that is greases / lubricants. These are the four I use most often. I use petroleum jelly, I use this lithium based grease, I use copper grease, and then I also use this anti-seize aluminium lubricant. Petroleum jelly is really good because it can't withstand heat very well, so it means that when you apply it to something, it will either evaporate or it will kind of leach out a bit. So it's great for applications where you need to grease something temporarily, but then you don't need any lubrication after it's all heated up. For example, in this video, I show you how to install a rear main seal, and I use this on the outside of the seal because when you put the seal in, you don't want the outside of the seal to rotate, you just want the crank to rotate inside the seal. It can also be used for putting AN fittings together so they don't become seized. It can be used to put hoses onto barbs easier, and there's just tons of different uses for it, and it's nice and cheap, so it's great to have. This lithium-based grease I use more as like a multi-purpose grease. I use it, for example, when putting the thrust bearing onto the transmission with the clutch fork. I use that for the lubrication, not on the actual contacts. I use it for suspension bushings and components, plus then some like dowel pins on transmissions, and also wheel studs, because putting a quick dab of grease on this each time you take off your wheels, depending how often you take your wheels on and off, will help ensure that the lug nuts will never seize up, because if a lug nut seizes up, that could mean goodbye to the stud, goodbye to the wheel nut, but even worse, goodbye to the wheel. Next is copper grease or copper anti-seize. I use this on brake components, like for example on the back of brake pads in between the piston and the pad. It helps reduce squealing, plus then also on the very tips of the fork on the clutch to the thrust bearing, plus then also on the slave cylinder, just on the little tip. Give it some nice lubrication, and because it is really good with heat, it always stays there and does its job. And then lastly, this is one thing I've only started using recently, but it is Permatex anti-seize lubricant. When I built Mr. EJ, I needed to remove the turbo just after it was done, and because I had torqued everything up to spec and everything, getting some of the nuts and bolts off were really difficult. So it meant that when I took them off, I looked into how I can prevent that, and this is what I got. So I use the Permatex aluminium anti-seize lubricant. I use this on pretty much every single bolt with exhaust components, mainly because there's not too much corrosion protection on the bolts. I also use this now for axle stubs to go inside of a hub, just so it means that it doesn't get stuck. And then also just on anything else that you really wouldn't want the bolt to get stuck and seized in there, because it would suck to remove or it would cost you quite a bit of money to replace that actual component. Before we move on to the final two items, one thing that I would like to pair with these, a little accessory for grease, is small little paint brushes. These are great because you can just put a little bit of grease onto the brush and you can apply them in really tight spaces. Plus also you're not putting a big glob on, you're getting it into the nooks and crannies of like the bolt or the nut, so you can be sure that it won't get seized and there's full coverage on all of the mating surfaces. So finally, onto the last two items because they go hand in hand and they pair together well. So these last two items I find extremely important, and that is torque wrenches, plus then I don't have a physical version of the product, but service manuals. Just to start off with the torque wrenches, they're extremely good because it means that you can torque everything up to factory specifications, so you know that you're not over tightening or under tightening. Plus then also, especially with components that require multiple bolts or fasteners, examples, head studs on engines, you need to make sure that every single bolt is applying the same amount of pressure. So it means that you get an even compression, so there will be no leaks and no failures. These are extremely important in situations like installing heads on an engine, and you really should invest in a good one. I personally have 4 torque wrenches and they all serve different purposes. I have my main big 1/2-inch drive one, which I use for just any sort of big high torque components. I have a small 1/4 drive one that I use for just smaller stuff because it can get into a lot of areas easier. Plus it also can apply a less amount of torque compared to this one. I also have a 3/8 torque wrench with a flex head that is great for hard to reach places. And then also another 1/2-inch torque wrench for wheel stud because it's a cheaper one and I take it to the racetrack. So if it gets banged and knocked up around and slightly out of calibration, I'm not too fussed because it's not too expensive. I use 2 types of torque wrenches. I use digital ones, plus then I also use the clicker type ones. They don't really make a difference. They do the same job, but especially with the 1/2-inch one, I like the digital one because it does angle as well. Angle is really important on certain components, and especially with this, you can plug in the torque, you can plug in the angle, and it will tell you exactly when both of those tasks have been done, and it'll tell you when to stop. So finally, the last item I'm covering with this, because I don't have a physical copy, so I would have nothing to show, is service manuals. I have all of my service manuals in a folder on Google Drive, so I can access them whenever I want, wherever I want, and you can get them from, I believe it's Heinz, that make the proper book version, or you can go online like eBay and search for electronic copies, or if you just do a little bit of Googling, you can often find some other copies out there that you can access for free. Service manuals are one of the most useful things you can have in your arsenal. Whether it's trying to find the correct torque spec for a specific bolt, or looking for diagrams of where each component goes, or just looking up different references for wiring, it has it all in there, it's all accurate, and it's all to OEM specifications, just like it came out from the factory. These service manuals have got instructions on how to do pretty much everything from removing an engine to rebuilding an engine to installing new wheel bearings or installing new suspension components. It has everything in there, all the specifications, and it's all nice, clear and concise. If you do use an electronic version, I highly recommend you use a version that has got all the chapters bookmarked so you can quickly skip through all the different sections to find what you need. It can take a little bit of time to get used to reading through them, but Once you get the hang of it, of using the search functions and the bookmarks, it's really easy and really quick to go through to find what you need. So that is my list of 8 things you need if you're a home mechanic. I hope you like this style of video. If there was a video like this 7 years ago when I first started working on cars, it would have helped me so much. This is all stuff that generally, if you just work on cars at home and it's not your job, it's stuff that you don't really know about, but once you find out about it, it saves so much time, effort, and helps you build better and more reliable cars. I want to film some other videos that is not just going through the different builds I have, because that's probably getting a little repetitive and boring. So if you do have any topics or suggestions of stuff I should cover in a future video, leave them down in the comments section below. If you also did like this video, please hit the like button. And if you are enjoying my content, hit the subscribe button as well. I just hit 150 subscribers, so thank you so much to everyone out there who has subscribed, supported me. Plus also big thanks to all the people who've given me feedback about how to edit the videos, different things I should do. It's been really helpful. As always, you can subscribe to me on Instagram at 07carves. I just post different updates, stories, just whatever I'm working on in the shed. That's it for this video. So thank you so much for watching again. And until next time, keep on learning.